go ahead and get started. Again, thank you for being here. So I've had my coffee, so I think I am ready to go. So we're just going to spend a few minutes talking about culturally responsive engagement of structurally oppressed students living with psychosis. I know that is a mouthful. These are our objectives. So by the end of the presentation, should be able to identify those early signs and symptoms. We could be here all day identifying those, and we'll also talk about interpretation. So, we say signs and symptoms, usually some very basic ones that individuals identify, but that can vary, based on cultural experiences. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about the structural disadvantages that impact student engagement and community partnership, and then spend some time identifying practices that promote collaboration and connectiveness. So we are your presenters. So Crystal and Nick are here, and just wanted to stress, and we were laughing right before we got started. So I wanted to make sure that I added that this project, this statewide promotion, is a collaboration between Northeast Ohio Medical University, The Ohio State University, and Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. I really wanted to swap out the PowerPoint because I left off the of. I have it on my flash drive, but Nick told me to stop it. So we can move forward. All right. So just, we're doing these jobs. We're here presenting, but just to tell you a little bit about, who I am. So I am a licensed social worker. So been a social worker for a long time, probably longer. Yeah, not going to tell you how long, but I've been doing it for a while. Initially, undergrad, I was in a organization, and it was just like an organization where everyone went, and I realized quickly like my values just didn't align with the organization. Went on and it was an outpatient for a long time. That experience was awesome. And by the time I left there, my title, I was a manager, like case management manager, did a lot of training. And so this was a natural transition to move into Northeast Ohio Medical University. Best practices of schizophrenia treatment is a center I spend most of my time. Training, consultation, like some project management work. And so I say that for a couple of reasons. For one, just like our job title is consultant and trainer, but it's so much more. But also just me as a social worker, a lot of times people think that only means direct practice, and social work is so broad. But when I am not doing all that, I love to read. And you would think like I read all day for work, right? I'm writing all day for work. But that is just one of the things that grounds me, it centers me. And I was intentional about the Toni Morrison in the background. Toni Morrison is from Lorain, Ohio. And I also told Nick this morning that when I had gotten down here, I found a little indie bookstore called Birdie Books. Birdie is not giving me a commission or anything for advertisement, but it was just pretty cool to be able to support something local. And then last but not least, what is important to Crystal family? So I have some young people in my world that actually they just finished up track. So that was a big deal. It was his first season, so first time running track, and they made it to state. So I thought that was a big deal. When I asked him about it, I texted him and like, well, how did things go? He's like, I don't know. We were 13th or something. But I was like, that's still a big deal that you made it to state. And then the 7-year-old, she is playing baseball. And so that's very interesting. Just even at 7, now she's not calling it community and connection, but just watching her interact with her teammates, with the coaches. And they're at an age where the coaches are getting along. So even when she's up to bat, sometimes the other coach, if her hand's not in the right place, like he'll help her. So it's pretty cool to watch. So those are just a couple of things that are important to me. Nick is going to introduce himself, and then he is going to talk about signs and symptoms of first episode psychosis.
Okay, thanks, Crystal. Yeah, my name is Nick Dunlap. I am a licensed professional clinical counselor. My background, prior to coming to the Best Center, I worked in a community substance use treatment facility for a long time. Again, I'm not going to date myself, but I worked in many different capacities at that agency. I worked in the prevention department, progressed up as I was going to school and getting my license as a counselor, ultimately becoming a substance use counselor. So a lot of my background is in substance use and providing that care. Made the transition to come to the Best Center, was interested in making a change professionally and looking to do something different than I had been doing for some time. And so it was a good transition for me. Enjoy greatly the work and hearing Jessica talk this morning about the collaboration between the centers at NeoMed and the Best Center being one of them, and us having the opportunity to collaborate with Jessica and others at the Ohio Program for Campus Safety and Mental Health has really been wonderful. So when I'm not working, I am a lover of vacation. This is a picture that I took at Ocean City, Maryland, and I love the beach, love the ocean. I was telling Crystal a recent vacation I went on. My vacations have changed over time with having children. It used to be nice and restful and relaxing, and I could take a nap on the beach and things like that. We have a 4-year-old at home that does not permit that on the beach anymore. And so have had to adjust accordingly in terms of what I get from my vacations. What is important to me, friends and family are incredibly important. And then I have a little curling picture here. My family likes to tease me because I am a lover of competition. So they say I would watch anything on TV if it was two groups, two individuals, anything competing against each other. And so it is something that I appreciate and I enjoy watching people accomplish things that maybe they never thought they could do. And so I really appreciate seeing people achieve potential and achieve things that again, that they didn't think that they were going to be able to do. So as we get started with our presentation, I'm going to start talking a little bit about some of first episode psychosis specifics and talk about various aspects of first episode psychosis. One of the big picture things that Crystal and I hope that people can take from our presentation today is to think about disabling the label that sometimes are placed on individuals because of their mental health. And so a lot of the community partner agencies we work with, and they're working with individuals that have a mental health diagnosis. And we have to have mental health diagnoses at community mental health agencies for various things, including reimbursement for services. But when we're working with individuals that have those diagnoses, we don't have to use those. We don't have to use those diagnoses in our interactions and our discussions. Understanding their experiences is far more valuable than putting a label on what those experiences have been. And I'll talk a little bit about using shared language and when working with individuals or conversing with individuals, using their terminology or finding what their terminology might be in terms of describing their experiences is so important. And when we talk about a word like psychosis, a lot of individuals that have lived experience don't like that word of psychosis. And as you saw in the previous slide, they talked about it being a disconnection from reality. And a lot of individuals will say, I'm not disconnected from reality. And so we want to keep that in mind. We'll use the word psychosis during our presentation today for the purposes of the presentation and describing symptoms and describing certain things. But it's also something we want to keep in mind when conversing and talking with individuals. So part of the reason why first episode psychosis is so important, and I was struck by the speaker from the Southwest Ohio NAMI group, and talked about the vulnerable population of college-aged individuals, and it certainly applies here when we talk about first episode psychosis. because most individuals will start to experience those symptoms when they're of college age. And so a lot of our partner agencies are working with individuals in our program, and Crystal will talk a little bit about that later, are of that age. And I don't know about any of you, but I think back to those college years, those 18 to 22, 24 years old, depending on how long college was. Fun, but I don't think I'd want to do it over again, right? I think that there's a lot of stressors, a lot of new experiences, and whether it's change in friends, change in identity, living on their own for the first time, maybe moving away from home a great distance. So a lot of stressors and a lot of things that could bring about psychosis for individuals. And so it's something to keep in mind when we're talking about a college-aged population. So when we talk about first episode psychosis, we're talking about the early onset of someone starting to experience symptoms. And we'll talk about symptoms more specifically here in a second. But this is when individuals start to experience those symptoms, and they're going to be, for the most part, going to be somewhere between the ages of 16 to 24 on average when those symptoms start to occur. We always want to keep in mind of a lot of different things when we talk about symptoms of psychosis, and I'll touch on that. But most importantly, we want to take into account an individual's experience. We want to take into account an individual's culture. Because something that may be viewed as symptomatic might be part of their culture and what they're experiencing. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay. When seeing someone who's experiencing symptoms, there is a lot of confusion and a lack of understanding about what they've experienced. And also, not all of a person's experiences are going to be equal across individuals. And so one of the things that I like to highlight when we talk about this is that when you're talking about college students, I mean, you're talking about individuals that are experiencing their symptoms for the first time, and how those might be different from someone who has had other life experiences or other life conditions where they are used to navigating systems to get help. Someone who's experiencing an onset of symptoms, any mental health concern or issue, including psychosis, they're not going to have years of experience of where to go, who to ask for help, what kind of help would they benefit from. And so it's something we want to take into account when we have those interactions. If they're reaching out for help, that's a big step because they aren't going to know how to do that. Individuals that are dealing with mental health issues aren't going to know, okay, I need to go to the community mental health agency. There might be a medication that can help. There might be a counseling or therapy intervention that can help. I might benefit from having a case manager. They're not going to have that knowledge. And so a lot of the things that individuals would do is isolate themselves, because they're confused, they're worried about how their symptoms might be perceived by others, and so they may start to isolate. They may start to not interact with people. They may stop going to class. They may stop going to work. All of those things are important to take into account because there is that confusion and that lack of familiarity about what to do next and what can help them. I'm going to touch briefly on some myths and myths versus facts. And so one of the most common myths that exists is individuals who have serious mental illness are prone to violence. And as Crystal and I were preparing for this presentation, I was thinking about kind of the unfortunate circumstances of a lot of the mass shootings that have occurred around the country. And typically the first thing that you will see, you turn on the news after one of these occur, and they will talk about the perpetrators' mental health issues. Oh, they were involved in mental health, or they were on mental health medication, or something along those lines. And in the past, what would happen is oftentimes, whether it be a news outlet or other media, they would sometimes present people that would be able to say, research has shown that individuals with serious mental illness are far more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators of crime. The unfortunate circumstance with the frequency of a lot of these mass shootings that have occurred is it's difficult to keep up, unfortunately. It's difficult to continue to have someone be available or put that message out there. And so the public it continues to hear this message of someone with mental health issues is prone to violence, is prone to violence, is prone to violence. And we really want to try to reduce that, because all that does is increase the stigma that someone with serious mental illness is scary, that we need to put them somewhere so that they won't hurt anybody. And in reality, it puts them at a tremendous disadvantage in terms of being able to get the help that they need. The other area that we talk about is with regard to serious mental illness and employment. And one of the major components of our programming that we incorporate with community mental health partners is the idea of supported employment. And we recognize that individuals with serious mental illness, including those who have experienced psychosis, can and do hold meaningful employment opportunities. And even when there are circumstances where individuals maybe are still symptomatic or still experiencing symptoms in some capacity, they still benefit tremendously from employment, whether it's from the social aspect, the self-esteem aspect, increase of income. It can certainly go along there as well. And so we always want to keep that in mind, that individuals can hold incredibly meaningful employment, regardless of where they are in their journey with regard to their mental health. So talking a little bit about some of the symptoms and how those symptoms can apply in education, employment areas. So looking at some of these symptoms, I'm not going to touch on all of these in the interest of time, but we always want to take these symptoms in combination with the individual and their experience and other aspects. So some of these symptoms in and of themselves might be related to mental health, might not be, but we want to take those into account and be able to explore those. But looking at things like disorganized thinking, and so individuals that may be in class difficulty following lectures or following instructions, suspicious or unusual thoughts. If they are in an auditorium, I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience, but I remember when I was in college in my general psychology class, we were in an auditorium with, gosh, it was probably 200 kids in this auditorium. And someone who has suspicious or paranoid thinking might be apt to not go in there because they might have some fear of another individual that's in there, and so they may start to not go to class. And so there are those things that we want to certainly take into account. The other thing that I want to highlight before I turn it back over to Crystal is that we don't want to automatically assume that what someone is doing is automatically a symptom of mental health. So for example, I knew of someone that was experiencing some pretty significant depression. And a lot of the behaviors that this young lady was experiencing reinforced that. So people would see her, and if she was sitting around not doing anything, they would view that as being a symptom of a depression, an overall lack of energy, overall lack of motivation to do things. And what happened was there was blood work that was completed for this individual, and it turned out that she had a really out of whack thyroid, which of course was impacting her energy level, was impacting her ability to drive and to motivate herself. And so whenever we see some of these symptoms, we want to be very, very careful in terms of saying, oh, that must be something of a mental health symptom, or they might be dealing with some type of mental health issue. We always want to talk with the individual to have a little bit of a better understanding of what they've experienced. Oh, I went the wrong way. Okay. And as I've touched on earlier as well, we want to take into account an individual's culture. I was at a presentation that was working, it was around first episode psychosis treatment in a Latinx population. And they shared an example of how an individual, a young girl, was born shortly after her grandmother had passed away. And the family had been telling this young girl ever since she was born that her grandma would often speak through her, because in their culture that was something that they had believed in because of the proximity of the death and the birth. And so as she grew older, she ended up reaching out to community mental health agency to engage in treatment. And one of the providers very wisely had said, that is not a symptom of psychosis. That is not delusional thinking. That is a cultural belief of her and her family. And so they were very, very proactive, I would say, in being able to set that limit, that when she would talk about, well, my grandmother speaks through me, or sometimes my grandmother talks through me, that wasn't pathological, so to speak. And so it was something that I think we always need to take into account when considering symptoms that an individual might be experiencing. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Crystal.
Thank you, Nick, for doing such a thorough job and just remembering when we talk about psychosis, it's such a spectrum. Like we seem to understand that for other conditions, but I don't know why we continue to miss the mark, specifically when we're talking about, just even different experiences and how that is just a spectrum. I am going to spend a few minutes talking about, and I am missing the mark right here. Stigma and discrimination. So I know, like, think about our second objective in regards to structural disadvantages. There's been a lot of leadway. I know we're talking about mental health more. We talk about it every day, but I think just, in the community, people are talking about depression, anxiety, but psychosis continues to be considered one of the most highly stigmatized conditions. Unfortunately, I've even heard individuals in attempt to maybe engage someone that has what appears to be like major depressive disorder, say things such as, well, you're not as bad as some of those individuals, right? And so when we talk about why individuals might not engage, if I'm hearing it, they're hearing it as well. When we think about images, social media, TV, people still watch TV, the news, Nick mentioned when we're talking about mass shootings, the first thing people jump to is mental illness, specifically psychosis. And the literature talks about a perceived discrimination. I put the actual discrimination in the parentheses because I've been a witness to it. As I said, I worked in outpatient for a long time, and I had a colleague at the time, I think his title was supervisor, but if his team needed help, he would just jump in. And so I don't know if someone was off or, again, they just needed help, but he was assisting someone with housing. So they had an appointment, they were going to meet with the property manager, and in the person's face, so in the supervisor's face, in the participant's face, the property manager said, I don't work with individuals with mental illness. So, of course, everybody had to pause. And he said, Crystal, what is wild is that that's not the first time that's happened, because his team was primarily working with unhoused individuals. So that was not the first time. So I'm sitting there gulping, and he just reminded me that it just happens every day. And this is not a term that I coined, but it just made me think about like everyday saneism. So people are more comfortable talking about ableism, but saneism is almost like a sibling. And saneism is important. It's important for us to have those conversations because that is specifically discrimination, oppression against individuals with mental illness or individuals that are perceived to have a mental illness. And so think about some of the things that have happened in the community very recently. That was an example of like someone, making people uncomfortable, and all of a sudden then we have this fatality. That's an example of everyday saneism, but it's not always that extreme. Again, bringing it back to the example of individuals just trying to find accessible, safe housing. And so as we're thinking about engagement and why people wouldn't engage, are there any examples that maybe just not someone, in your work capacity, but maybe something you read about or something someone has told you that made you think, as I'm talking, like, maybe that was Satanism? Or it was just like this kind of like bigger discrimination. It wasn't just about this person didn't like people living with a mental illness. There was very intentional discrimination going on. Anything you want to share? Chris? Right, right. Just around guns in general, is that what you said? Right, right. So just based on again, mental illness or perception of mental illness, making this very like definitive decision, and depending on who you are, there's many families, communities where that is what they do, right? So maybe where there's just like obtaining guns, they hunt, whatever, and how that could then like other that person, right? And so also as we're thinking about disclosure, so all of that is connected. So I wanted just to make those connections. So if people are navigating the community and, when I talked about situation with the property manager, that happened in front of the supervisor. So I imagine that person has had many other experiences that no one was a witness to. And so I even think about I taught part time for a long time, but I did at a local state community state college, and there's been a couple of times where near the end of the semester, someone would ask for accommodations, and I was thinking like, why didn't she say something earlier? Why didn't she ask me? Why didn't she come talk to me? They knew what I did. I talked about it all the time. And then I had to like step out of myself and remember it was not about me, but just, again, disclosing, then is putting themselves, potentially putting themselves out and opening themselves up for that discrimination. So as we continue to talk about barriers, there has been a lot going on in the last 3 years. And I always want to point out, so a lot of the conversations that we are having are also happening at like a higher level. So the American Psychiatric Association is the oldest medical association, and they actually issued an apology. And it's significant for a couple of reasons so that it's right there. We can hold them accountable. We can start asking them, what are you doing? So yes, the apology is nice, but action steps are my love language. But it's also important because it talked about historical harm. So oftentimes, like when things were coming up around vaccination, right? So Tuskegee came back up as a reason maybe the Black community was mistrustful. I will say, as time moved forward, actually, Black Latinx community were more likely to actually to get vaccinated. But yes, the past matters. So history matters. James Baldwin would say history is now, actually. But it was also important for them to say, and it continues to happen by the disproportionate amount of Black and Latinx individuals that are diagnosed with schizophrenia today. So that's important because oftentimes it distances us if we can say, oh, well, yes, I understand why they're mistrustful or don't want to engage because of things that happened in the past. But people are having these experiences, something that happened last month, something that happened yesterday, something that's happening this morning while we're having this presentation. So again, things that we know that we probably don't even need to continue to actually study is that non-Hispanic Black people are 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, Latinx 3 times more likely. And also want to remind people that individuals with psychosis, as well as all of us, have multiple identities. So Dr. DeLuca talks about how culture and psychosis are intertwined. So just like as I stand before you as a Black woman, can't separate those two. So when we're talking about, LGBTQ plus community, one could also be Latinx and also be non-binary. I know Ajelsa Fernandez, they talk about their experience often. Ajelsa is a national peer advocate and has been very vocal about their experience, first time experiencing psychosis in college. And, so we talk about these overlap of identities that instead of getting the help they need at that time, that's been several years ago, there were a lot of questions around their identity. There were a lot of questions about what does it mean to be Latinx. And so we could spend a whole morning just talking about trauma as it relates to psychosis. Just wanted to stress that in many of these communities, there is an increased risk to trauma, and then we know that potentially that can contribute to an increased risk of psychosis. And just briefly, when we talk about misdiagnosis, again, if we have individuals that are being disproportionate amount of individuals being diagnosed with schizophrenia, then we're also misdiagnosing. And so this is an example of how individuals, I will usually wouldn't quote an article from 1996, but I wanted to show that this isn't a new conversation. And so what GARA, they just were asking, well, were those individuals more likely to screen positive for major depression? And essentially the answer was yes. So that's important when we start talking about, for one, we're talking about engagement. So all of a sudden for someone to realize, well, maybe all this time I was not even receiving the correct diagnosis, but also treatment, right? So could be completely two different treatment interventions, and that was missed in the group that screened positive for major depression. And then trauma and discrimination, just more and more research coming out in regards to the potential contributor to developing psychosis. So we know at least 70% of individuals living with psychosis have experienced at least one traumatic event. Many have experienced many more. Some things that stood out to me is like lack of green space and environmental toxins. Has been shown to correlate with psychosis. So we think about the whole person. That's not necessarily new information when we think about asthma, for example. So if we're thinking about asthma clusters, and there's certain areas, more children are experiencing asthma, and then they start looking at the environment and then notice that, the homes that they're living in, the factories that are at the end of the street, contributing to what's going on with their health. So it's like the same idea, same concept. Can't say direct causation, but there is this relationship. And so with that, typically, again, we have individuals that have been pushed to the margins or more likely to live in these environments. And then we have that perceived or actual discrimination, again, has been associated with psychosis. And one of the reasons we really want to stress that early intervention is so important is that, young adults express distress over police involvement. And so in this particular study, it was a group of Black and Latinx young individuals already in a early intervention program, but they were looking at their pathways through care. And one thing that definitely could be a barrier was if there was a bad interaction with the criminal system. And so this actually came from another Myers article, and I believe this individual's name was Mark. That's one of my favorite names. Mark says, I went to outpatient treatment maybe 1 year steady, but I was still not in agreement from my diagnosis, especially the way it all happened, them arresting me and stuff. So Mark was in his own neighborhood, and the police came, they handcuffed him, and they put him in the back of a squad car. And as a result, that was how he thought about outpatient treatment, and it completely changed his trajectory for about a decade. At the time of this interview, Mark had found his way back, but he did that on his own terms. So just wanted, us to start thinking about like why people aren't maybe engaging. We're here, we're always thinking that, saying we have the best practices, we're affirming, we're safe, but want to highlight that people are bringing their experiences to the college campus. And then Nick is going to start us off with talking about accommodations that can bring connection.
Thank you, Crystal. Yeah, so as we think about what can be some next steps, so as we work with individuals or maybe we come into contact with individuals, what can we do to try to help in those circumstances? And we'll talk a little bit about more specific action steps and accommodations that can occur within university settings or college settings, but we'll also talk a little bit about, Crystal will come back and talk a little bit about ways to connect with community mental health agencies and ways to establish those relationships and opportunities to do that. So a couple of things to think about with regard to accommodations, and the second bullet here is something to really highlight is whenever we have the opportunities to help individuals through specific accommodations, the idea is to help reduce social anxiety, feelings of paranoia, other symptoms that might come up. So a lot of times we want to maybe converse with the individuals and start from asking that question, what can be most helpful for them? What would they appreciate the most in terms of making or hoping to help them feel more comfortable in situations in the classroom or in other settings. And so one here is talks about the idea of having an ally, a family member, a friend, someone in meetings that maybe maybe the meeting involves planning or accommodation specifically that might be available for the individual, but having someone there can help to increase comfort for the individual or for the student, we can say at this point. And so finding out who those supports would be is also important, right? We use the word family, but sometimes individuals, they might not say, hey, my blood family is not supportive. I have other people in my life that I would much rather be there. So exploring that with them as well in terms of who might fall into that category. Um, Also looking at early registration and specifically with areas involving internship or practicum sites. So this way we could explore those sites that would be most welcoming, I guess, if we could use that terminology. As Crystal was talking, I was thinking about an example she was sharing about the Sainisms examples, and I was thinking about sometimes some of our partner agencies where they're working with individuals to try to find employment, and it comes up occasionally, more often than I would like to hear, but a lot of times employers are like, yeah, no, I can't work with someone that has mental health issues, or we can't employ them here. And so those are the kinds of places we would want to steer away from to ensure a comfort level for the participant, and what other accommodations could be available for them in being able to complete their internship or their practicum, for example, and then also other physical accommodations. Things such as ramps, accessible gender neutral bathrooms, restrooms. Those are the things that we would want to find out about as well. Things in the classroom, I think, can be really important for individuals that would benefit, for those students that would benefit from being able to take breaks. We talk with a lot of our teams that we work with at community mental health agencies, and we talk about scheduling encounters, scheduling appointments with them, and finding the amount of time that is ideal for them. So for students that are maybe, I just use examples like they have a Tuesday, Thursday class that goes an hour and 15 minutes. That's a long time to be sitting in one location and to try to follow along and keep up, especially if they have symptoms that could make that very difficult. So them having permission to be able to get up, to maybe find somewhere to walk around, go for a walk, come back, taking breaks, kind of those breaks, those mental breaks to be able to kind of take that time to recharge and come back, can prove to be very, very helpful. It can help to reduce the kind of the mental fatigue that maybe an individual, a student might be experiencing in those circumstances. I think this one is really important when students are given the opportunity to complete a group project and they are maybe they have concerns about being with other people. Maybe they are experiencing paranoia of some degree. And so maybe giving them the opportunity to complete the project on their own as opposed to in a group setting can prove to be very helpful. It can help to ensure to optimize their success in that project as well. So a couple of things to kind of keep in mind with regard to accommodations and ways to really be able to try to help individuals in that immediate moment while they're engaging in classes. And I'm going to turn it back over to Crystal, and she's going to bring us home and talk about a couple of topics, and then we'll answer any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you, Nick. And so I know everyone is busy and most of us are wearing many different hats. So just some everyday interventions. I thought about my cousin, who is of the Muslim faith, and her going away to college. So when we think about collaboration with local faith communities, faith can mean many things. But when she shows up on campus, I do wonder, will she find community there? If she can't find community there, if we think about case management needs, is there someone that's going to be able to help her find community outside of the campus, right? Or is there an opportunity, right? So is there an opportunity to maybe create that on that campus? So just, that collaboration is important, as well as, faculty, staff, and others' participation in nearby community events. So someone close to me is having this big community event Saturday, and it's going to be some of the usual players, the outpatient mental health agencies, but there's also going to be individuals talking about food and food disparities and helping with that. There's going to be someone there from the diaper bank. So you think about students that have families and diapers are expensive. So just thinking about like being out in the community, so building those relationships. So when someone does have a need, then it's just an easy transition, not expecting everyone to know everything that resources out there. But again, if we think about, is there someone or a couple people or an office that then the student can be directed to? So when there's a need, whether there's food, whether they need diapers, other household items, that we're able to help them make those connections. Partnering with your student health services. So at Neomed, we just really believe the head and body are connected. So it's not so much. We're spending a lot of time talking about mental health, but it's all interconnected. And just what are those relationships? When I think about primary care providers, are they aware of individuals living with mental illness, living with psychosis, that are attending, your university, your college setting, many individuals with lived experience. I just heard someone talking about they have a pretty chronic condition and they are just not telling their specialist. They are just not there because they've had some pretty bad experiences in the past. And so, we think about those collaborations and bringing awareness. So, if someone's already just either, whether we're talking about routine appointments or if someone has something more significant, how can we increase that engagement? And then most of us are either supervisors, supervisees, a combination. So thinking of those spaces where you're already going to have to show up. So rather that supervision, smaller team meetings, group meetings, and exploring that inequity and power during those meetings. Again, maybe if we're talking about my Muslim cousin and you all of a sudden realize like, we don't have anything for that individual on our campus. We haven't really been addressing the needs of students with families, like using that space to, come up with some ideas, some action steps where you can start flattening that hierarchy and addressing those inequities. The power of peer support. I talked about it, Joseph Fernandez, and I was on a webinar with Emika Chima. And I know we're going to hear more from students with psychosis this afternoon. But, I just, one of the things that came out of that, if people didn't hear anything else, get peer support. Get, peer support, identify individuals, and not just identify them, then set a program up so they can be successful to do the work. And one of the things, and I'll just quote Emika, talking about their experience, he said, like-minded peers and advocates were helpful during my education experience. They were people I could relate to, an environment where people were treated like human beings and not just a diagnosis. They looked past my diagnosis and helped me create a community. So it goes back to when Nick initially was talking about disabling the label, that, moving beyond that label diagnostically for someone, if we're going to be honest, for someone to bill, oftentimes that was where that label is coming from, but to be able to just kind of like listen, to show some empathy, and honor individuals' humanity. We did want to highlight Coordinate Specialty Care first episode Psychosis. So there are 2 programs in the state of Ohio. So we have a program at Best Center at Northeast Ohio Medical University, and there are also programs through the Ohio State. Ultimately, looking at personal treatment plans based on individuals' goals, needs, and preferences. And it's appropriate for students between the age of 15 to 35. Already, I just said this yesterday, once we put something out there in print or in a presentation, then it's already outdated. But this is a map in Ohio. So the counties that are highlighted in blue have coordinated specialty care programs. I will say that Warren Clinton, we're going to fill that in when we get back. So they are taking enrollees. They are still building, but they are accepting new participants. And then also, kind of, we go up northeast, so the other part of the state, Lake County just recently started enrolling individuals in their hybrid team. So if you would go to Ohio Moss's website, mh.ohio.gov, get help early, then that will take you to the map, and it will have more information about identifying programs in your community. If there is not a program, we're working on it, but there is not a program in your community, you can click on the findtreatment.gov. And we're just going to leave you with one of my favorite quotes, Toni Morrison from Lorain, Ohio. I tell my students, when you get these jobs that you have been so brilliantly trained for, just remember that your real job is that you are free. You need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower someone else. And thank you for being with us this morning. We are going to take questions, but I also want to make sure you have your code. So we don't want to forget your code. It is 39 FOIL. So 39 FOIL. So that is your EADS code for the presentation.
Okay, any questions? Yes. So that's a really good question. And I think for a lot of our partner agencies, we utilize a kind of this coordinated care approach so that if someone, let's say, is in, so I'm going to answer your question both ways. So if someone is engaged in one of those programs, our hope would be that somebody on the team, a supported employment education specialist or a case manager, could assist that participant or that individual in hopefully pointing them in the right direction of ways to advocate for themselves or who they would need to talk to on a campus setting to be able to advocate for themselves. In situations where maybe they're not involved in services, but that type of situation would occur, I think that's going to vary based on what is available for a student on that specific campus or that specific university. Um, so it's hard for me to answer who or specifically where they would need to go in order to advocate, but I know I don't know. Can you think? I can't.
I would say, because, again, I taught part time. And it's that onus does fall on us. And I know everybody's busy, right? I know everybody's busy, but as the instructor, then because it's one of the things like once you know, so, Ruth talked about her experience earlier, and I had a couple situations, and I probably was getting on people's nerves, and they were tired of hearing from me, but it was important. So I think your question is, I'm seeing students, whether we're specifically talking about mental health or things that are going on in the state legislature, really coming together, organizing. And I know like faculty and staff are going to have to take some of that energy and also coming together. But yes, and like pushing it up. So, I know faculty and staff also then need that support from administration and other leaders. But I just is one of, when I think of a couple of situations, like it was just being persistent. This is needed. They need the accommodation. Okay, they don't have the paperwork. Can you explain it to me? So maybe I can explain it differently. I can explain it better. So ultimately, the student is able to get what they want and be successful in the space.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Crystal and I talk a lot about when we present about first episode psychosis programming is one of the benchmarks that's talked about in a lot of those programs is this idea of resiliency, right? And so one of the things that Crystal and I always try to preface our talks with is that for some individuals that have experienced serious mental illness and this idea of, hey, you can bounce back, you have the resiliency to do that. For some individuals, that's exhausting because they have experienced so much up to that point in their life that the idea of, all I've had to do is bounce back. I've always had to fight against this or to fight against that. And that is exhausting for individuals that have had to continue to do that. And so I think when we try to when we do present when we're given opportunity to present, we try to prevent or help to prevent something like that from happening because it shouldn't be on the individual. Those systems should be in place so that they don't have to work hard or harder or be more resilient. They have been resilient enough up to that, if I can use that terminology. So we want those systems to be in place so that it's easier, not harder, for those individuals to get the help that they're looking for. So, yeah.
I just read an article yesterday. It was about reframing resilience. And resilience can mean resistance. And I love that. Right? It's like shaking things up, not accepting the status quo. And, I'm one of the people I believe that systems existing how they are now are not working. And so there are times that we just have to come in there and disrupt. And thank you for being here.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.